Welcome to the Reformed Fringe. This is Doug and I's very first live recording with an audience. And audience, please participate. Let them know you're here. That's my wife and my daughter. They're here. Us kidding. No, the whole church showed up. It's been great. So Grace Reformed Church is here tonight, and for those of you that are listening, Doug came into town, and we had the opportunity to have him come tonight and do a special podcast on Genesis 6. So we're going to jump into that in a minute. For those of you that are listening and are not here, I'm going to let people though who are watching or listening to this online, this podcast, the design of it is we want to take the supernatural parts of our Bibles, the Bibles that we often are ashamed of, or as Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, the fringy side of our faith. We want to put it back into the Reformed, and that's what this podcast is about. So Doug is a pastor. Doug Van Dorn is a pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church in Northern Colorado, which is in Boulder. It's been there over the 22 years. And I'm John Moffitt. I'm the pastor of Grace Reformed Church here in Spring Hill, Tennessee. And this is fun. This is like a hometown moment. This is so much fun. I'm excited about this.
Yeah, you said you kind of had a little bit of butterflies going.
We were at dinner and I was like, I'm actually kind of nervous, and I never get nervous. So it's fun. This is exciting. It's a fun subject. So obviously, you're here to hear us talk about giants. So what we wanted to do is structure it this way, is kind of walk through the common, I would say, questions and misconceptions about Genesis 6. And then we are going to walk through the biblical arguments of the why is it there in Genesis 6? Like what's the whole point of it? What does the New Testament have to say about it? And the last part that I'm most excited about, why does this matter? At the end of the day, why does it matter? Which is probably a question that most people have. Why does it matter what the Bible has to say about this? So real quick, Doug and I did start a little online community called the Reformed Fringe for people to ask questions about this very thing. If you're listening to this, we'd love for you to come participate in that. All right, Doug, we're going to go ahead and jump into this. Typically, there are 3 historic views. I'm going to let you give just a synopsis of it because we're not going to dive into the 3. We're going to dive into and they can be categorized down into 2. So I'll let you take over from here. What are the 2 categories and what are the 3 views? And then we'll pick our view and explain it.
All right. Well, I think we should read the passage first, just because some people may be tuning in for the first time and they don't know what we're talking about.
Before you do, could you hand me my water bottle?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
So it's Genesis 6 and chapter verse 1 and then verse 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So that's your text.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question becomes really probably the first question, especially if you're reading the ESV, because it just transliterates the Hebrew word Nephilim. It's like, what is a Nephilim? Okay, so then you have...
Which is what's called a transliteration.
It's a transliteration.
So it's literally what it says in the Hebrew.
That's the Hebrew word for it. Yeah. So what is a Nephilim? And there has been, like you said, 2 or 3 main views. There's kind of sub-views. I look at it as really there's 2 views that have dominated church history. And I call them a naturalistic view and a supernatural view. And then some of the sub-views can go between natural or supernatural. Just depends on how you interpret those particular people. So the natural view has really dominated the church since Chrysostom and Augustine about 400 AD. And they came to the conclusion that the sons of God are the sons of Seth, the son of Adam. And then the daughters of man are the daughters of Cain, the son of Adam. Okay, so you have essentially, I call it like a Christian marrying non-Christian is essentially what they're getting at when they say that, because they'll say that because Noah comes from the line of Shem, they'll say that this is the godly line. And then Cain, because he was the evil one, you read that in the New Testament, obviously you read that in Genesis 4, that his entire line is ungodly. One results in Enoch at the 7th generation, and the 7th generation of Cain is Lamech, who, murders a man. So it's godly people marrying ungodly people. And that's what the view has been.
Right.
And then the other view is that, and I make sure that I tell people this every time I can, because I think it's that important to understand. The other view did not come into existence in the 4th century or the 3rd century or the 2nd century or the 1st century. It existed in the centuries before Christ. And it was the only known view that we have before the New Testament writers end. And that is that the sons of God are angelic beings, and that the daughters of man are the children of Adam. So it becomes a supernatural view, right? So one is humans marrying humans. The other is angels somehow marrying or taking wives or whatever they're doing with humans.
Right. So those are your options. Just for fun, how many grew up for being taught that it was the Seth view, that these were the people of Seth? So it wasn't angels, it was the Sethite. How many would say that's the view that they held? Okay, great. How many said how many were taught that it was angels? All right, great. How many were never taught anything? Most of you. Okay, there we go.
Good.
So avoided altogether. Right, which is what ends up happening. One of the things that I've been talking a lot at our church with, and then obviously on this podcast, and you've been writing about it. I mean, you wrote it back in 2013, but thinking about it a lot longer than that, is how the Christian culture has shifted to not want to talk or think about the stranger parts of our Bibles. Everyone that is a Christian has to believe in something that is supernatural, because the gospel itself is not a natural message. It's a supernatural message, right? You literally are telling people about a God who became a man, who lived a perfect life, died, and then rose again. Oh, and while he was here, bringing other people to life and walking on water and turning water into wine. The whole story around Jesus is beyond belief, which is why you have humans standing in front of him saying, yeah, we just saw you feed 5,000 people, but give us another sign. And he says, you will never believe, right? Because these are spiritual matters and you're trying to understand them from a physical perspective. And this is what we do with some of these phenomenal passages that are just kind of beyond our capacity of understanding. And I think that in many ways, I understand, and I would say I'm sympathetic to why people would want to go to the Sethite view, because, well, we have been so indoctrinated and so programmed to think you can explain everything with science and you can explain everything by what you see. And this is so far beyond. Not only that, the church started embracing this non-supernatural view.
And it wasn't just the church. So, Augustine and Chrysostom are like the pillars of the post-Nicene church. Mm-hmm. And their views went, especially in the Western church in Rome. And then as people who are in the Reformed world and Protestants, we come out of that line. That's the view that the Reformation inherited.
Right.
And it really wasn't questioned by the Reformers. And they gave the same arguments that the earlier guys gave. I do want to make one more mention, because we said there's a third view.
Right.
And somebody might be listening going, oh, you didn't say anything about the third view. Well,
maybe it's the right view.
It could be. I don't think that it's necessarily wrong, but it's a view that the sons of God are kind of dynastic kings, and that they were taking women that they shouldn't have been taking. And the thing is that many people that hold that view take it as human kings and, women. But other people would say that those kings could be demigods, or they could be even angels themselves. So right. That's why I'm like, to me, that third view is really, it kind of blends into either one of the others. So it's a supernatural or natural. And I think it's the easiest way to think about it.
Right. Okay. So those are your views. What we want to do is jump into the text and say, okay, what does the text seem to be pushing us towards? We're going through a series right now in our church on how to read the Bible, on hermeneutics. We just did a podcast recently on hermeneutics, like how do you approach scripture? And hermeneutics is just a big word on tools, like mining the text, tools that you use to gain the understanding of a text, right? Now, some people believe that they read the Bible with no bias, meaning that I don't lead one direction or another. I'm going to just allow the text to tell me wherever it goes. And as every human being would love to have that as a capacity, that's just not the case. You are born with a bias, which is depravity, and then you are given a new bias by your culture, and then there's the biblical one. And how much of your depravity and how much your culture plays into it can shock you. So if you go in saying, I know I have a bias, but I don't mind it being altered, what authority at the end of the day is going to alter it? Is it history? Is it culture? Is it going to be the church at the end of the day, right? And in our confession, we say that Scripture is the final authority. Scripture is what we lean on. And so there are tools by which we're going to use to gain this. Now, history and what others thought about it is vitally important to us. That being said, Doug, before we jump into this, I don't know if you have these quotes here, but the view of the angelic view, that these are angels, that they ended up making these giants, there's been a lot of quotes from the first 400 years of church history that was the view. I know you had mentioned this.
Yeah. So I don't have the quotes in front of me, but
they're in the book, which is an advertisement by the book.
There's an entire appendix. Like every known source that we have in the Jewish part of interpretation of this was supernatural up until the 2nd century AD, and that includes like 20 different texts.
Sure,
like
Justin Martyr.
Yeah. No, Jews.
Oh, sorry, Jews. Thank you.
Yeah. And so then I would include that in the New Testament, and then in terms of the early church, every text that we have up until about 350 AD, so that's longer than America's been a nation, was also supernatural view, with the exception of possibly one comment by a historian named Julius Africanus. And actually, people that think that he's taking the Sethite view, it's not clear that even he is doing that.
Right.
So, and that's another 20 to 30 different writers and texts that we have that say that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's 50 to nothing in the early church. That's a blowout by any sense.
It's a blowout. It's good to see where church history has come from. What has the church believed in the past? We are a Reformed church, which means we believe the church at one point got off kilter. It was off, therefore we're Reformed. We're using Scripture to bring the church back to its original ad fontes, or back to this font. So it's good and healthy to see where the church has been, and then how is it aligning with Scripture. Okay, so that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump in and use some of the tools as a church. And if you've heard the previous podcast, you will hear these tools. When you understand the basic structure of the Bible, that will help you with complicated passages like this one. For instance, as Doug and I would do at any time, if we were to jump down into a text, let's say we're not familiar with it, it's one of the minor prophets, the first thing Doug and I are going to do is remind ourselves what kind of book we're reading. This is a book about Jesus from beginning to end. That's not going to leave our mind. So at the end of the day, we know that Jesus is the point and author of the book. Secondly, we also know that this is unfolding a story of redemption. This is the covenant of redemption. It's telling us about the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. So somewhere in this passage is unfolding this part of the narrative. And then the third part of it is now looking at the immediate context. What's going on here? What did it set? How did it apply? And then everyone always asks me, what commentary set should I buy? I'm like, well, you already have one built in. It's called the New Testament. We should go to the New Testament and ask ourselves, does the New Testament talk about the Old? So now that we've read the text, we've kind of talked about the historical views. By the way, if you ever read a commentary, this is what they do. They quote the text, then they tell you all the views, and then they start using the tools to start mining the text to come to its conclusions. So let's go ahead and jump into it, Doug. We're dealing with a story, and the very first phrase that we're coming across is that marriage is happening, but it uses two separate parties defining this marriage. The one party we're familiar with says the daughters of men. That's pretty simple. Now, you're not going to make a defining statement like the daughters of men if it's just humans were getting married.
Well, you would think, right? So, if you look at who is actually in the text, it's really important. And I think the most immediate context is the most important thing that you can do. So when people go to the Sethite view, they will go to the chapters before this, and then they will say, look, that was all about this line of Cain and this line of Seth. And so obviously that must be what Genesis 6 must be. Or else why would he have put those chapters ahead of this? And there's a logic to that I understand. But it's more important to actually look and see what the text itself says and then go to the surrounding context.
Yeah.
Okay, you know what I'm saying? So the first thing you come to is the word man, when man began to multiply. And you need to know the Hebrew word for that is Adam. So when God makes Adam and we capitalize it, that's actually the Hebrew word Adam.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the word here. When Adam began to multiply, so mankind, human beings. And then it says, this is really important, daughters were born to them.
Mm-hmm.
To who? It doesn't say they were born to Cain. It doesn't say they were born to Seth. It says they were born to Adam.
Men.
Daughters were born to humans.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it's into that, I think, that your comment about why would you need to say that unless there was something else going on needs to be understood.
Right. So paying attention to the structure, the keys, the importance of what's being said. So we hear there are humans being involved. This is verse 1. And you're not going to set up that there is humans involved unless there's something else involved, which comes in verse 2, which is the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. Right?
Yeah,
all of a sudden, after a few thousand years, women are attractive.
That's exactly what it says. And so you would think that what it says would be enough, right? And yet people read in this, daughters were born to Cain.
Yeah.
That's what they're reading. And sons of Seth saw daughters of Cain were attractive. And that's not what the passage says.
That's right. And not from a biblicist standpoint. We're literally saying, hey, okay, I'm okay at times where the previous context is going to flow into this context. And if you know about the story, Cain's going to be the evil nation. And the argument is being that God has always said that we need to be separating the people of God, need to be separating themselves, right?
So let me make a comment about the broader context, because this actually does have a parallel and something that came earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not chapter 5 and chapter 4 with the genealogy. It's the beginning of chapter 4. What happens in the beginning of chapter 4? Adam knows Eve and gives birth to a son.
That's right.
And so that's the birth story. And this is the second birth story.
Right.
Okay. So it's the two birth stories that are being compared. And in the first story, it's a human and a human give birth to a human.
Right.
And in this story, it's different because men are having children, and whoever these sons of God are see that they're attractive. And like you said, so for the first however many thousand years of human history, they didn't know women were attractive. That's kind of bizarre.
So it would be the narrator, Moses here, is telling us as he's writing this passage that you have the sons of God and they see that the daughters are attractive to them. And it says, and they took as their wives any that they chose. Again, this is very strange language. Well, then we should probably identify who are the sons of God, right? This is a phrase that is used, if you want to know what it is in the Hebrew, it's B'nai Elohim. It literally is son of Elohim, or son of God. And so you could say that, and this is where things can get confusing, because we would say, well, we're the sons of God and we're humans. How many would say that was might be the first thing that you jump to, right? These are sons of God. These are Christians. And so, well, humans weren't being called sons of God at this point. And this is important to understand.
Yeah. So what that's doing is it's bringing New Testament theology of something that is true, but something that comes later, and it's reading it back into a story in Genesis that's taking place before the flood.
That's right.
So it is true. Paul calls us sons of God.
Right.
Who does he call sons of God? Well, Christians. And so what they're doing is they're reading, Romans 8 or something like that back into Genesis, but that's anachronistic. That's reading something that happens way later and bringing it back into something that's the past. And that's often not the best way to go about figuring out what something means.
No, because you're going to run into some issues let's go ahead and jump over to Job, because this is going to be the exact, you have descriptions of, again, sons of God, and Job 1 is this description where you have, and we all know this story, right? So if we jump over to Job, the story is that,
I think it's actually better to go to chapter 38 first.
Well,
even though they're mentioned earlier in the book. And the reason why is because it sets a context that allows you to see the historical place where the sons of God are. So if you're reading Romans, right, and you see that the creation longs for the sons of God to be revealed, and he's talking about Christians, he's talking about that to a church in Rome after Jesus rose from the dead and calling them sons of God. That's the time of that. But if you go to Job 38, this is the Lord answering Job out of the whirlwind, and listen to the context of when it says, so who is it that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man, I will question you and make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? So when are we talking here?
Talking about
Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? If you were to put a chapter in the Bible of when that takes place, it would be when? Genesis chapter 1, right?
Right.
Because that's when God creates. And so then the next verse says, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. So somebody's singing and shouting when God is creating and laying the foundations of the earth. And the thing is, when God lays the foundations of the earth, you're talking day 2, day 3, and humans aren't even made until day 6.
Right.
And so how could there be humans singing for joy when there aren't humans that are on the earth, right? So these sons of God, that's exact same phrase that's used in Genesis 6. These sons of God are there with God, watching him create before humans exist. And it's the exact same title that you find in Genesis 6.
Right.
So that gives you now something, okay, that's not anachronistic. That's actually, those beings were around before the flood. And so unless they all died off, they could still be around at the flood.
Right. Because sometimes in Job 1, when people read this, they would think, oh, okay, so this is Job 1:6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. They would say, oh, these were the kings or the rulers of the world. And so there was this council meeting, which is also kind of a strange thought to think about.
That they're going with Satan?
Yeah, I know, right?
How does that work?
You got human kings and Satan. No, what you learn is that later on the sons of God were actually existed before humans did. They were created before humans were. Therefore, this phrase, sons of God, is being used not as humans. It will eventually be used for humans in the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, it's not once or twice, it's many times.
So the Job 1 and 2 is important because it gives you a setting. And so where's the setting for where they're meeting? It's not on earth, it's in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to God with Satan to the heavenly court, and then they're going to have a discussion.
Yeah, so it says present themselves before the Lord.
Before the Lord.
That's right.
Okay, so, and there's a parallel to this in actually Psalm 89. And this is verses 5 through 7. And it says, let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. So the heavens and the assembly are the same place. Who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the sons of God is like the Lord? A God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones and awesome above all who are around him. So the setting for those 3 verses in Psalm 89 is heaven, just like the setting for Job 1 and 2 is in heaven.
Right.
And frankly, just like the setting for Job 38 is in heaven. So what you're starting to see, and this phrase, sons of God, is only used about 10 times in the Old Testament, is that every time it's used, it's talking about these heavenly beings that existed before the flood.
Right. So this becomes a phrase that would be common not only to biblical writers, but as an example, Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar sees the fourth, because you guys remember the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and there's a fourth in there. And what does Nebuchadnezzar say of the fourth person in there? Because he's a pagan king. How does he word it?
He says something like, I see one of the sons of God.
But is it gods or gods?
Or, well, it
the
could be
gods.
one of the sons of the gods, yeah. It depends on the translation that you're using, but it could be either one.
Right. But his point being is that he sees three humans, and then he says as a phrase that whatever is in there, this is not.
Well, yeah, because the fire is like so hot that even the guys outside of it can't walk around. And it's what it even make to say that he's talking about some guy that just happened to walk inside the fire, right?
A king showed up, another king from another, right? Or a Sethite showed up, and, right? It doesn't make, so when you realize there's multiple times in scriptures, they're in the heavens and they're singing praises. They presented themselves before the Lord. They show up in a burning furnace and nothing is being burned on the inside, but everything is being burned on the outside. We're dealing with something that is not human at this point. All right. So this is good. This is good exegesis. This is good work. Anytime you come across something and you're like, okay, well, who are the sons of God? Let's do a word search. Let's do some background checks. Now we know, okay. And Psalm 82 is another example of this, where you have being mentioned, humans, not a human being, but they are being mentioned as these, I'll just go there real quick so you can read it, because it's very similar to Job 1. So Psalm 82 says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So this is the same idea, this word Elohim, and there's a council there. So they're coming and they're sitting in this presentation.
In heaven.
Just like Psalm 89, just like Job 1.
Because God takes his place in the council.
That's right.
So where would that be?
That would be in the heavens.
It's exactly parallel to Psalm 89, right?
Right. So we have a lot of data telling us that the sons of God are being used as angelic beings, and we're not seeing this context being used for humans or human kings. Okay. So first of all, you see the structure in verse 1. We're talking about humans. And then all of a sudden the author switches and goes, okay, now we have sons of God. So if we go back to Genesis chapter 6, so you have the sons of God. So now you realize, oh, these are, you could say, angelic beings. These are beings that are not human. We'll just call them angels just for the sake of clarity.
Eugen calls them angels, so
sure,
that's fine with me.
We'll call them angels. So the angels saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Okay, first objective that, how many of you have heard this is not possible because angels don't get married? They can't get married. Raise your hand, right? Jesus says this. How many of you aren't going to raise your hand no matter what I ask you? Okay, I'm just checking here. All right. This is the common objection. Doug, over the years, how many times have you heard this? Jesus says, I'm going to take the view of Jesus. Jesus says that angels can't do this.
I've heard this almost every time I talk to somebody about the view.
Okay. So let's think about the context of Jesus. What is he talking about?
Well, the exact context is he says angels in heaven don't marry.
Well, the context is heaven. So that's when you start there. Yeah. They're asking him, who's this woman going to be married to?
Right.
Which of the 7 brothers? Right. So the context is heaven. That's what we're talking about.
And death.
That's right.
They died.
So they died, which means they're no longer human. They are,
they're no longer embodied.
Right? Humans are part of the spiritual realm. One day will be embodied. So that's the first context. And then he says a comparative statement. And what's the statement?
They will be like the angels in heaven, neither marrying nor giving in marriage. So the question becomes, what angels is he talking about? Is he talking about fallen angels? Because Genesis 6 is talking about fallen angels.
That's right.
Because what's happening here is not a good thing. The angels that Jesus is talking about are not fallen angels.
That's right.
So, okay, if you take Jesus as seriously, and I actually, recently a friend of mine started thinking maybe Jesus is actually being sarcastic because he's talking to Sadducees who don't even believe that there are angels, which is kind of funny.
These beings that you don't believe in, it's like that.
Yeah, so it's like, basically his answer would be, it doesn't matter what I tell you people, you're not going to listen to anything I say anyway. So they'll be like the angels in heaven who you don't even think exist, will be marrying and giving, they won't do that.
Right.
But the greater point, if you assume Jesus is being serious, he's talking about angels in heaven. He's not talking about angels on earth.
Or angels in general.
Or angels, yeah.
Because the whole context is, what is this heavenly experience going to be like? And he explains it in this way. So then you could, if you want to, let's just say that that is one argument on the angels do not procreate side. Okay, we'll just throw it on that side.
That is an argument for it, but Jesus doesn't say they don't procreate. He simply says they don't get married.
Which is the difference.
Lots of people don't get married and they procreate. And they're not supposed to. That's the point of Genesis 6, I think.
Yes. And this is important because the question wasn't procreation capabilities. The question was, is she married to 7 men? That's the question. And Jesus is like, you don't understand how the new heavens and the new earth work. Nobody's married. There's no giving in marriage. Okay. So that is the context. But this isn't the only place that angels are referenced as it relates to their capacities. So let's turn over to 2 Peter, because I think this is a great place to jump to. Again, one of the best commentaries of the Old Testament is the New Testament. Is there anywhere else in the New Testament, and there is, Peter twice and Jude reference angels and reference this particular section, which is Genesis chapter 6. So if you guys remember, we covered this a few months ago, but we're going to go ahead and go through it again. So this is, he's talking about, well, I'm just going to read this whole context. This will be good to hear. So he's writing to a hurting church. They're on the outskirts of Rome. They're feeling spiritual attack, and they're wondering, is Jesus really going to win? Is he going to conquer? And he starts to talk about this in a positive light. Like, let me remind you what happened. Yes, the world was in chaos, and this is part of the chaos he's talking about. So verse 1, but false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. So he's dealing with false teachers. And what's the context here? Sensuality, sexual issues. This is a sexual sin issue, right? So this is very important from understanding a context. What are we reading about? And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. Okay, he's saying their day of judgment and a reckoning is coming. Well, how do we know this, Peter? Well, let me tell you what happened in the past, because this is what he does next. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as the righteous man lived. So are you guys following this? What is he doing? He starts off with angels.
And it's good to finish verse 10. And especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passions and despising authority.
That's right. Bold and willful, they did not tremble as they blasphemed the glorious one. Right? So he's saying what you're seeing on the physical realm, look what God did to those in the spiritual realm who did this. So he mentions the angels. And in what context is he mentioning the angels?
Sexual sin.
Sexual sins. And then what illustration does he give? First of all, their original context, which is the flood. And then in a comparative context, Sodom and Gomorrah.
So he gives the verse 4, God, and actually he calls them angels. So if you call Genesis 6 sons of God angels, you have Peter
doing it.
So he has Genesis 6, 1 through 4 in verse 4. And then verse 5, he didn't preserve the ancient world. That's Genesis 6, 5 and on through that story. And then he goes to Sodom and Gomorrah. And then, so that's Genesis 18. And then you've got rescuing Lot. And so he's going in a chronological order of Genesis. And it's important because somebody might say, well, maybe the angels, they sinned at some time prior to, like in the Garden of Eden or something like that. Well, first of all, if you say that, you have absolutely no biblical reason to believe that. It doesn't say that. There's only one being there that's supernatural, that's sinning. That's Satan. So that would be an argument from silence when you actually have Genesis 6 1-4 that is exactly what he's telling you here. Okay, so again, if you're going to make that kind of an argument,
Sure.
it's like, where are you getting that from? And then second, it's also important to know that Peter and Jude is doing the exact same thing, are giving a very common list that the Jews gave in book after book after book of ethical instructions. It's the exact same thing, the exact same stories.
Mm-hmm.
And in those stories, they actually call them the Watchers. So they actually use Enoch language instead of Genesis 6 language. And when you compare them, they're all doing the very same thing.
Right.
Okay, so now you've got the weight of everybody else who's talking about this, who's even more explicit about what you're talking about when you come to trying to figure out when is Peter, what is he talking about? What does he have in mind?
Right. So this is actually the second time Peter mentions it. I'm doing it backwards for a reason here in a minute. But if you go to 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter uses it the first time he wrote a letter to them. And so he's speaking about, this is this section of what we call the victory lap of Jesus. When he dies, he goes down. And why would he do a victory lap? We're going to get into this in the latter part of the podcast of why this matters. But this is 1 Peter 3:18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. So he's talking about the gospel here, right? This is the good news of what happened, comma, if you're reading along with me in your Bible, comma, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, comma, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. So what is Peter referencing? A story everyone is familiar with, and he calls them not kings or rulers or Sethites. He calls them spirits, right? So this is the second time. His second letter, he calls them angels. This time so if you want to translate them as messengers, flat out, he says they're spirits, because when was it proclaimed victory? When Jesus died and he went down to the realm of the spirit and said, you tried to stop me from coming by creating another race, which we'll get here in a minute, and you failed. Now, I think Jude is probably one of the most powerful passages.
Yeah, he says it a little bit differently.
Sure.
I like to start in verse 5 just because it's one of my favorite verses. I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved the people out of the land of Egypt. Guys, first time I ever read that in the ESV, I was like, what did I just read? Jesus saved people out of the land of Egypt? I'm like, I've read that many times. I don't remember that. I went back to my old NIV and I saw it says the Lord saved people out of Egypt. And the ESV says Jesus saved them. It's like, what's going on here? So we actually have something called a textual variant here, where some copyist either took out Jesus and put in Lord, or put in Jesus and took out Lord. And when you're doing textual manuscript criticism, you're really trying to figure out what's the more difficult thing to understand. Because the difficult reading is almost certainly the right reading, because it's easier to imagine some scribe coming along and his job is to copy the text for the next generation. And he reads that and he goes, that couldn't possibly be what that meant. That has to be a mistake. And, he doesn't have Grok or something to go and tell him what all the manuscripts say. So he has to make a decision. And he goes, all right, I think that must have been some guy added that in, because I couldn't believe Jesus saved anybody out of Egypt. It has to be the Lord. And so he substitutes and he puts in the Lord. Anyway, that's not about this, but
an upcoming podcast, you can listen to that one.
Verse 6, and the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority. That's why I wanted to read that verse.
That's right.
Verse 10 in 2 Peter, because Jude is focusing here on the same exact story, but instead of here, the sexual problem, he's talking about their authority problem. They had rules that God gave them, that you are not allowed to do this with human beings. And they said, we don't care. And then he goes from there to exactly what Peter did, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise brings up the immorality they did a minute ago. They likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire. What's the unnatural desire? Unnatural desire is something you think of when you're dealing with something like homosexuality. That's what Paul talks about in Romans 1. It's unnatural. If Genesis 6 is really just Christians marrying non-Christians, that's not unnatural. It's wrong, but it's not unnatural.
That's right.
Unnatural would be an angel wants to be with a human.
Marry a
That's
human.
unnatural.
Yeah, that's right.
In the same way, which Sodom and Gomorrah is the perversion of it. So a lot of people go, well, Sodom and Gomorrah is about pure homosexuality. I would say it's not pure homosexuality. It's even worse than that because it's angels and human men.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So
we now have 3 biblical examples that the writers are using it in its a proper like they're pointing it out saying, you see how bad that was? And they're using it as examples to show the church what God is doing, one in victory or just how bad that is. Like, don't do this. This is bad. And so this is important to us because it's not, I don't think 1 Peter, 2 Peter, or Jude is unclear. They're talking about angels, spirits, and then it says left their proper place of authority, right? So this is all the context. When we go back to the sons of God, married these women, we have enough biblical data here to say the argument is leaning very heavily that these are, according to the New Testament, if we're going to let Peter and Jude tell us, these are angels. That's the data that we're going to come to. Okay. So there's problem number 1. Are these angels? Can they procreate? According to, we saw what Jesus says, that context is being married. Now Jude and Peter are saying, oh, it's clear this is what they did because they keep comparing it in context of sensuality.
One more thing about does an angel have the biological function to do this? So I actually don't think you have to believe that they do because there's room, I think, in the text, because it doesn't technically say that they married them. It says that they took them as women. So you could have it as a kind of a violent taking of some kind, which could be, I suppose, some sort of a genetic manipulation that they were doing on them. We don't know.
Sure.
But I take the view that they actually were impregnating them.
Right.
And how could you say that? Because that's ridiculous. They're spirits. Aren't angels just demons? Well, no, they're not. If you go to Genesis 18, you find that 2 angels came to Abraham with a third who is called Yahweh. And they have feet.
Because they get washed.
As he washes their feet. And they eat because he cooks the fatted lamb. And then they have a dinner together. And then they go into tents and they have conversations that other people in other tents are listening to. And they start laughing because they can't believe it's true. That's all embodied language. And furthermore, they're called men, which is, it's not the word Adam. There's 2 words for men in Hebrew. One is Adam. The other one is the word Ish. And humans are called Adam and Ish. Angels are never called Adam, but they are also called Ish. So somehow we share Ishness, Ish men, in common with angels, but we don't share Adam with them. And what's Adam? Well, Adam is that we're made from the ground. Okay, so, but nevertheless, they're called men. And you see that, they're called men in both testaments. When the angels at the empty tomb, God, I saw a man. I saw a couple, I saw these men. They were bright, glowing. They're men.
Right.
All right. And the last one is to go back to Sodom and Gomorrah. When 2 of those men go to Sodom and Gomorrah, and it also calls them angels, the men of the city say, bring them out here because we want to do things with them. Mm-hmm. Now, how could that be possible if it's not possible?
Right. Well, not only that, but even Lot's response was, well, that's not possible, guys. That's ridiculous. Don't you see that these are angels? That's not a response. The response is to protect them and offer his daughters, which is horrendous.
Crazy.
Yeah. Right. So all of this is data. All of this is helpful for us. Even believe, like, I don't know where that notion came from that everything in the spiritual realm is non-physical. You have Jacob wrestling with an angel.
Yeah.
So they have a body, so much so, even in the New Testament, it says you can see one and you don't know that it's an angel. Remember, this is in Hebrews. The writer, I think this is a funny one, by the way. The writer of Hebrews is like, he's wanting you to be hospitable. Remember, there are no restaurants, there are no hotels. And when people travel from town to town and you live on the outskirts, People are stopping off at your place for water and for some help and some food or a place to stay. And so you're going to be entertaining people. And the writer of Hebrews is like, I want you to be nice to everyone. You might entertain an angel.
It's actually very possible that Hebrews has in mind Genesis 18 when it says that, because that's exactly what Abraham did. He entertained angels.
That's right. So he's saying that you could have them unaware. And Paul even says they can show up, the evil angels can show up in your church as prophets or as those to whom are angels of light. You would assume that they are there for benefit, but they're there to hurt you. Again, you're not going to be able to identify them as they're going to look like a human. So this is not far-fetched from a biblical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That took a long time. We're going to jump into the giant stuff here
All right.
a second. The other reason why most likely this can't be humans is that what comes out of this union, sure, we have seen human beings create some pretty big human beings, but that's not what it said came out of them. We have a new species being described coming out of these beings. So Doug, I'll throw it back over to you.
Okay, so the Nephilim, like what in the world is a Nephilim? All right, so the most popular view of what Nephilim is and where the word originates is that it comes from a Hebrew verb, and the verb is nephal. And the verb nephal means to fall. And so they'll say that a Nephilim is a fallen one. That's if you hear most people talk about it, that's almost exclusively what they will tell you that a Nephilim means. So it's just a fallen one. And then they'll say, see, there's nothing gigantic about it. There's several problems with this. The first one is that we actually have the word appear in one other verse in the entire Bible, and that verse is in Numbers 13, and it's the very last verse of Numbers 13, but you need to read the context of it, because this is the story of the spies going into the land, and then they come back with this bad, evil report. And what's the report? The report is, we can't go take that land because everybody in it is gigantic. They would kill us all. All right. So when you see that, and then there's a whole bunch of like tribes that are mentioned there that we find out in other places are giant tribes. And we don't have time to get into that tonight, but the verse is verse 33. And there we saw the Nephilim. And then it says the sons of Anak, those guys come up again later in Numbers. They come up in Joshua, and it's very clear that they're giants there who come from the Nephilim. Now, here's where it gets so wild. Nephilim appears twice in this verse, but it's not spelled the same way in Hebrew. The one time it adds an extra letter Y or a yod. And that's very, very important because there's no way on any possible grammatical writing of the verb nephal that it could be spelled that way. But there is a possibility if the word is actually in Aramaic. Now you go, well, how could it be Aramaic? Well, it's because, you know that verse where you've probably read it. I don't remember it's in Numbers or Deuteronomy, but it says, Moses was a very humble man. The most humble man on the face of the earth. I remember reading that, I was laughing to myself like that. A humble guy probably wouldn't write that about himself, right? That would be a narcissist, I would think.
Sure.
So that verse is a later insertion by a scribe who's trying to tell you something about Moses that you need to know to read the context. All right. So insertions like that, sometimes you read, and that city is still here to this day. Well, why would Moses write that? You know, it doesn't make any sense if it's taking place in the days of Moses. So if it was taking place, like say in the days of Ezra, then it would have meaning. So in later days, the Hebrew language stopped being used. And so they might have forgotten what the word Nephilim meant. And they might have started to say it comes from the verb nephal. Well, Aramaic is a cousin language of Hebrew. In fact, the alphabet is almost exactly the same. And so the word Nephilim in Aramaic means, guess what it means? It means a giant.
Giant.
That's literally the word that it means. And so when the Septuagint, the Greek translators come along 200 years before Jesus and they translate this, they use the word gigantus for Nephilim. And so this is one of the reasons why everybody just simply said this view is giants. They're giants.
Right.
And then not to mention every time these guys come up and anything is mentioned about them at all, whether it's in Deuteronomy 2, Deuteronomy 3, Numbers 13, going into books of Joshua. You go to Goliath and you read about Goliath is, 10 feet tall. And you go, well, where did Goliath come from? And you trace his genealogy. All these giants are coming from the same place. It's the same root. So that means this is an inescapable inevitability.
That's right.
Nephilim are giants.
Right.
And I never have heard Calvin or Luther or Augustine or Chrysostom or any of them tell me how giants came because Christians married non-Christians.
You can threaten your children. If you marry an unbeliever, you could end up with an evil giant. By the way, they're not just big people. That's the thing. When you read the Old Testament passages, you realize these are evil beings. They're not just big shacks. They're not just big basketball players. Speaking of, not only are they, sure, we have people who are almost 10 feet tall humans in the record of humanity. But I want you to understand when the Bible describes, and the Bible describes Goliath's armor, and you add it up. Are you ready for this? He's 10 foot tall, and his armor weighs 700 pounds. Take Shaquille O'Neal and put a man on one arm and the other arm and put one on his back and say, now go fight. How well do you think the guy's going to do? But Goliath was a feared warrior. Like, they were terrified of him in his armor, which means it goes to tell you he's 10 foot and there's something else desperately wrong with this guy, right? And so he's a part of the line of this marriage that ended up happening. Okay. We got to get moving here because I want to get to your guys' questions. All right. So if you keep reading, it says, now and afterwards, Doug, the reason why I have to mention this is because the flood comes and wipes them out. And yet Goliath is clearly post-flood. Yeah. Right? Now, Doug, I think you did list of it in the book. Yeah. And we're not gonna get into this full here. There's some theories on it. All I know is this. There's lots of theories. You can go check them out. All I know is they show back up. Because you have them in Joshua, you have them in the Promised Land, and you've got David and Goliath's story. And the text says this is how it happened the first time and after, meaning did it happen again? I don't know. I don't know if we want to get into this.
Yeah, we can get into it. The reason to get into it is because this is the number one question everybody asks. Yeah. Is, well, how'd they get there if they were all killed? Okay, so some people are like, well, you don't even have to go there because the Nephilim aren't even the children of the union in the first place. So what they'll say is, they'll say the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And then they kind of put a period. And also after that, after the Nephilim were there, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, they bore children to them. And that's what they want to say. So they want to say that the Nephilim are a different group than the children that were born. Right.
They just randomly mention Nephilim and move on.
Yeah. And it's like, well, so then who were the mighty men or of old, the men of renown? Well, it's then still the Nephilim. Mm-hmm. So you really haven't actually got out of the problem.
No.
You still have to explain also how they got there after the flood. Somebody will say, well, they're just children. But how did the Nephilim get there in Canaan after the flood? You have to answer that question. So there's 4 basic ways that people have done this. The first one is an old fairy tale that the Jews would tell their children about Og the giant. Og is the most famous giant in the Bible, even though you think it's Goliath, it's actually Og. The dude's bed was like 13 feet long and,
made of iron.
Made of iron. And Moses fights this guy and he kills him. And, big guy. Well, the stories they told their children was that Og was so big that he was able to hitch a ride on the top of Noah's Ark on a unicorn, and Noah fed him through a hole in the ark. So I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. But they told their kids that. Good bedtime story.
So going back to the grammar and the structure and the context, the structure and context should read, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men.
The point is that the Nephilim are the children that were born to them.
That's right.
That's the only reasonable way to read this verse.
Right.
But still, how did they get there? So another option is that some people say, well, the flood wasn't global, and so they didn't all die. Okay, well, that answers that question, but it doesn't answer the question of what's the point of an ark and having all these animals go on an ark if they could have just gone over the hill and not died anyways. I don't understand that one.
Sure.
So I don't buy that one. Another one is that somebody will say that, and I think it's more valid. Somebody will say that like the genetic material for a Nephilim was in somebody on the ark. And so none of them were giants, but their children could have been. That's plausible. And usually somebody will say, well, it's like Ham's wife or something like that.
Sure.
Problem is that if you keep reading in Genesis 6, you see that the whole point of God saving Noah is that he's blameless in his generations, which means he's perfect in his generations. This is language used of a sacrificial lamb in the book of Leviticus, that you couldn't take a spotted lamb or a lamb that had a physical defect and sacrifice. So God had to be perfect.
Sure.
So Noah is being described as being physically pure, not among the Nephilim. And so if somebody was on the ark that wasn't, that kind of seems to defeat the point.
Right.
And so that leaves you really with one logical last way to go, which is that while the angels that were in Genesis 6 were locked up, like Peter and Jude say, another group of angels, and I think this makes a lot of sense, they said, well, God said he's never going to destroy the earth again. So I guess we're good to go. And so they came down and they started doing the same thing.
Right. Which then if you read the story, you ever wonder why there are certain cities or groups of people, God says, including the animals, they are to be gone. And then you have cities, he's like, don't kill them, leave them alone. Well, if you go and look at the lineages and you look at where these tribes come from, what you realize is these are Nephilim tribes.
And in fact, it's even more than that all the tribes that God says you're not allowed to kill them. So yeah, they're related to Israel through bloodlines of like Lot and Esau, but also they also had giants in their land, and God gave them a land, and they had to dispossess the giants out of their land, and Israel was the last ones to have to do it. And so all of them are killing Nephilim.
That's right. Well, you even have the story of Saul. I'll let you tell the story, but the story of Saul, where Saul was supposed to wipe out all of the tribe, and he saves one. Who does he save?
He saves King. Are you talking about King Agag?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So he saves King Agag, and Samuel shows up, grabs the sword out of. I have children here, so we'll just say grabs the sword and does an Agag thing to the king because of what the king was. It wasn't that he was a bad king. What you learn is that Agag is a Nephilim. He's from this tribe.
He's from a lineage of giants.
That's right. So you have a lot of giant wars in the Bible. You can learn a little bit more about this in the book. But Doug, what I want to point out is that I want to make a connection now here. I want to make this a transition over to why this matters, and then we can open up for some Q&A. Peter is livid about what has happened, and he's upset that the church is underneath a lot of persecution, and they're feeling it. And so he goes to a story that's familiar to all of them, and the story was about the persecution of the people of God and how God protected them, and uses this as an illustration. So think of it this way. When you start in Genesis chapter 3, there is a story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve fall, and if you go there, I'm just going to go ahead and so you read it. You can hear the language. God turns to Eve and he says something extremely powerful. So this is now the deed is done. He's now turning to the beings and he's going to give them the result of what's going to happen next. He's telling us the next part of the story, which is fascinating. I will put enmity between the woman and between your offspring, or you could say seed here. Either one, you can translate it, Zerah, seed or offspring, and her offspring. So he's talking to Satan, and he says, between your offspring and her offspring. First of all, why does Satan have a seed? Why does he have offspring? Ever wondered about that one? So we'll leave that there. And then it says, he shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. Okay? So you're being told immediately that salvation this condemnation being put upon Satan for what he has done is coming from a human. And if it's coming from a human and Satan is sitting there hearing this, what happens just 3 chapters later? Well, they tried to take out Cain. That didn't work. It says sin is crouching at the door. And so literally, when Eve has Cain, she goes, I have got a man from the Lord. Like, this is it. This is the guy that's going to save us from being on this cursed earth where I've got to have pain in childbirth and he has to work in the garden with the sweat now. This place is horrible. Yeah. And all of a sudden he becomes a murderer. So that's not the guy. Right. And then men start to, like, thousands of people are now on the earth and Satan is going, man, it could be any of them. Any one of these people could be the seed. Like, this could be it. So according to what you read from Peter, Peter is saying these people and Jude, they left their proper place of authority and they polluted the seed line to where it literally says, guys, in the text that Noah's family, Noah was the last pure line. That's what it says in the text. That's what it meant. It didn't mean his righteousness. It meant he was pure.
Let's bring this up because since we're Reformed and we're Calvinists.
That's right.
Some people will say, well, Noah was pure and he was blameless because he had never sinned.
Well, that's ridiculous.
Think about how ridiculous that is.
Right.
In fact, Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. We believe in depravity, and you don't get any bigger of a statement of depravity than in Genesis 6 when it says, every inclination of every thought of all of his heart was only evil all the time.
But Noah.
But Noah. He's the only one that wasn't. Right. Exactly. So
Jesus and Noah, good dudes, until he gets drunk. Anyway,
when you read it as through the lens of total depravity, that should further show you that something else is going on and why Noah was chosen.
That's right. So Satan from in the garden and out of the garden has been trying to stop Judgment Day. He knows my head crushing moment is coming, right? And so all of a sudden you are seeing a corruption of the seed of woman. So that, well, if there is no humans left, not only are these giants, they're going to kill all the humans off. We're going to pollute everything that's there. There will be no more humans. And that fails. This is why the story is, you remember how bad it got in Noah's day? When Jesus died, you know the first thing he did? You know how you had tried to corrupt the seed and kept Jesus from coming? Peter says, while he was down in the underworld, setting the captives free, he did a victory lap by the Spirit to go, yeah, nice job, but I made it. This is, you guys, this is what Peter is saying, right? He's using that as an illustration. Satan keeps trying, because if you keep reading the story, the Nephilim is just one event in multiple events where Satan is trying to either turn them towards other gods, sacrifice their children, get them to worship anybody else but Yahweh, right? You shall have no other gods before me. Where do you think that came from? Satan. It's constantly ploys. And so when you get to the New Testament authors are like, listen, the world's in chaos. Satan is using all kinds of means. Look what he tried to do in the past. It didn't work. Jesus even gave him a victory lap. Keep trusting Jesus. He's going to take you home.
Do you know the story? You know why David and Goliath is actually in the Bible? It's not there so that you'll slay the Goliaths in your life. That story is there because it's a Nephilim story that comes straight out of the Genesis 6 story. You know why they chose Saul? Not because he was from the tribe of Judah, because he wasn't.
That's right.
And the Messiah was supposed to come from the tribe of Judah. Nothing could make Satan happier than to know that the anointed who's going to come and crush my head isn't going to come because the king is from the wrong tribe.
Yeah, like, oh, great. Israel completely messed up.
So what happens? That says that they picked a guy who was like all the other nations around them. He was a head taller than everybody else. What does that mean? Well, it seems to me like that's kind of a Nephilim reference, if you ask me. And so you have this guy who is evil, doesn't kill the giants. He's taller than everybody else, and he's from the wrong lineage. And then when the real Nephilim shows up in the battlefield, he's like, he's so scared of a guy. I think this one's funny too, because there's another variant on the height of Goliath. And so we read 10 feet tall, but the Septuagint says only 6'8". Well, if you see that Saul is a head taller than your average Israelite, that puts him around 6'5".
So a 6'5" guy's powering.
I had a roommate in college who was 6'8", and I'm not 6'5". I'm like 5'11". And it was intimidating. But if I needed to go in a rumble with him, I wouldn't have been running for the hills.
Right.
Okay. Saul was running for the hills because of a dude 3 inches taller than him. That doesn't make any sense.
No.
So
A 3-inch human taller.
who ends up killing Goliath? David. What tribe is David from? He's from the tribe where the Messiah was promised to be. He's from the tribe of Judah. God chose him because he's going to be the one through whom the Messiah will come, not Saul, because Saul isn't from the promised line. So that whole story, you guys, is there to show you that God is preserving the story of the Messiah to come. Has nothing to do with you slaying the giants in your life. It has everything to do with the literal king of Israel, who's from the tribe of Judah, slaying an actual Nephilim. That's what it has to do with.
So there's a double meaning on seed, your seed, her seed. So her seed just beheaded his seed.
He literally took his own sword and cut off his head.
That's right. So there's a lot more connection that can be made, but it's not just David and Goliath. It's not just Nephilim. It bleeds into more. But what you're seeing is the story being told from a humanistic standpoint, the seed of Eve. We get really excited about this. You know, Christmas is the fulfillment of all these promises, but there is an underlying story. Satan doesn't want to be imprisoned. He doesn't want his head crushed. And that story is popping up everywhere. And if you see, while Israel is constantly under this attack, and I mean, the story of Job is interesting, right? You just read that story. What does Jesus, or what does God ask Satan? What have you been doing? You ever, that's just a weird question. What you been up to? I've been roaming, walking around here and there. What you looking for? What do you think I'm looking for? What about this guy, Job? I would mess with him, but you won't let me. He goes, okay, you mess with him, but you can't kill him. I mean, it's this weird story. Are you guys not with me? Strange story. So you keep hearing this type of language. And when you get to the New Testament, all of a sudden you're seeing all kinds of weird attacks on God's people, demons and angels. And then Paul flat out says, when he gets to the church after Jesus ascends, he goes, hey, just to remind you, you're not wrestling against flesh and blood. And he starts to name an entire angelic host of beings that you're messing with. So what the story of Genesis tells you is, this story is wild and radical. And then you get to the New Testament and Peter, Paul, and Jude are like, yeah, we know, because that's the world you live in. You can't let the world tell you how to see your world. You have to let the Bible tell you how to see your world. And I'll tell you what, you're going to get mocked for it. And this is why Paul straight up says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel that's been handed to me, because my gospel not only saves humans, but it punches back and pushes back against the principalities and powers. And this is why you have an armor, and this is why you stand in the power of the Lord. Right? So that's why this matters, is that it's opening your eyes to the reality of what your Bible's actually telling you. And it changes your perspectives. Okay. We have 15 minutes for Q&A. Josh, do we have a microphone that maybe Dan could run around after Dan asks his question? Oh, we have it up here. Caleb's got it. All right. If you have a question, raise your hand. I need one or two so that we know where the microphone's going to go right after someone asks their question and we're answering it. So go ahead and put your hands up. Who has a question? We've got one here in the front. We got one in the back. All right, we'll start here in the front. And as soon as she asks it, we'll go to the one in the back. All right. Go for it. Nice and loud.
So, if Saul wasn't the true king of Judah,
Israel. Mm-hmm.
Was he a Nephilim?
Okay, so why did you bring this up? Because I think maybe some people missed the connection.
Yeah, that's a great question.
We could run the button.
Saul was not a Nephilim. He was a Jew. But they wanted to have somebody who looked like the other kings. And the best they had was Saul, because there were no more Nephilim that were in Israel. And remember, Goliath, he's not a Jew, right? He's a Philistine.
Mm-hmm.
So he's from some other place. And it wouldn't have been okay for them to pick a Philistine for their king.
And we know that kings some of them were Nephilim, because this is the story of Agag.
Yeah. That's the story of Og.
It's a great question. Yes.
Is the pollution of the human genetic line by Nephilim, like the way that Satan was trying to basically destroy the lineage of Jesus. Is that relevant today? Yeah, why or why not?
So it's not, I don't think that it's relevant in the same way, because Messiah has already come and Satan knows that he's already come. So he knows
that part of the prophecy.
He knows that he's defeated.
Right.
So I think that that's where you need to get to the whole idea of Peter talking about Satan prowling around like a lion. He's not only going after Christians, but I believe that Satan absolutely hates the human race.
Yep.
And so if he's defeated and God has still given him some sort of a leash, he's going to do everything that he can to cause as much havoc with our race as possible. And so I do think on that level that it's completely relevant to things that are happening today. Especially any kind of like a transhumanist movement, where people are trying to create human 2.0, or we're doing strange things with AI and wanting to wed humans with AI, or whatever the case may be, some sort of a mass genocide of the human race through nefarious plots that people have. Any of those things I think would definitely be related to the same kind of an idea that was going on in Genesis 6, minus wiping out the promised coming of the Messiah, because he knows that it's over for that. What do you think?
Next question. No, yeah, I think that you're getting at a question that's really complicated, and it is scary to think about. When the world starts offering solutions to our bodies, I tend to think, well, Jesus already offered me one. He says, in the new heavens and the new earth, he will fix what I have, which means I need to be really careful about what's being promised to me and where is it coming from and why is it coming? And am I giving up my humanity to get it? Those become very important questions. Unfortunately, I think our children are going to be wrestling with those a whole lot more than we are.
They are.
All right, next question right over here. So we have a husband and wife question. This could be interesting.
I think she's got a question too. But if a whole idea of the battle over the seed when Jesus is born, and obviously the wise men are able to see that something is happening, and I guess Satan must influence King Herod to allow this decree to kill all the boys under 2. Does Satan not identify who Jesus is in that moment to allow Jesus to escape that, or is that just God's provision over that story and how that happened?
That's a great question. I think I would say that he knew when the time was coming, just like the wise men knew and were able to come at the right time. I think God guided the wise men once he was born through some sort of supernatural intervention. But yeah, you get the feeling that Satan didn't know exactly who it was, but I would add something to that, which is that, especially as Matthew tells that story, Matthew's doing a play on the story of Moses.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so, he's working on another level of his literary design. What Matthew does is really cool. So you have a baby being born who goes down into, first of all, they try to kill him when he's under 2. He goes down to Egypt. He comes back out of Egypt, through water. And then he goes up on top of a mountain to preach the law. Who's that?
Mm-hmm.
You go, well, that's Jesus. And I said, well, it's also Moses. Exactly what happened to Moses. Because Matthew is casting Jesus as the greater Moses. And so I think that story, especially in Matthew's gospel, is really picking up on that.
Yeah, I think, I'm pulling this up right now. Paul even says, none of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. I don't think there was full awareness of exactly what was happening until later, until the full revelation of Scripture came. So there could be this was a shot in the dark, like, yeah, I think he's here. The wise men show up.
Prophecy is he's got to be born in Bethlehem. The signs seem to be that he's going to be born right about now.
And the wise men are here. Because listen, there's a network. I mean, Satan is all knowing, but Pharaoh's pretty powerful and he's in the right place. So if you don't think Satan's got people camped out there, And when the wise men show up, he's like, all right, let's just take them all out.
Yeah.
And how do they escape? An angel, right? An angel comes and says, you need to go. You need to leave. It's a fun story. Yeah, sorry.
Did God create the angels? And if so, why did he create us? Like, why not just change the angels to be human?
That's a great question. Yes, God created the angels. My view, it's speculative, okay? But my view is that God created angels to have some sort of, especially the sons of God, like there's a whole host of heaven. The heavenly host praises God. How many? Myriads and myriads, 10,000 times 10,000. How many different species are out there? I don't know.
He names a few.
He names
the Bible.
Yeah, the Bible gives us just a tiny glimpse into it. So yes, God created everything in heaven and earth. Your catechisms are not lying to you about that. But what did God create the sons of God to do? I think he created them to rule, but not here on the earth. I think that the whole point of the earth being created in Genesis 1 is that he's going to create his own special king that's really going to tick them off. Because this is a ball of mud who's not glorious and beautiful like Satan is. And I think you have hints of this in like Ezekiel 28, where because of the pride in your heart, you're in the guardian cherub of Eden, and you set yourself up and you think that you are so beautiful that you deserve all this. But no, I want to give it to this creature, this special creature that you don't think is all that much. And I think it really made him mad. And that's the impetus for the great pride and rebellion that took place, at least in Genesis 3.
Yeah. I mean, there's clearly some nefarious things going on in the garden, because did he really say that? Is that what he really said? I mean, he turns those who inherited this garden, he turns it against them. He turns them against God. And they begin to question God, and like, yeah, God is lying to us. And all of a sudden, I don't know what Satan thought was going to happen next. Like maybe God was just going to scorch them, or he's trying to get back at God. I mean, we don't know. That part of the story is not there.
Let me read a psalm to you. It's Psalm 8. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babies and infants, you've established strength because of your foes to still the enemy of the avenger. When I look at your heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? And this is quoted in Hebrews. Yet you have made him a little lower than the sons of God, or the heavenly beings, or as Hebrews puts it, the angels.
The angels.
You made us lower than them, but you crowned man with glory and honor, and you have given him dominion over the works of your hands, and you put all things under your feet, all sheep and oxen, also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the seas, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And I think this actually goes beyond just humans, your question, us humans, because the plan of God from before the time when he created Adam and before there was any fall was that the Son of God would incarnate as one of us and be a human being. That he would empty himself of that divine prerogative that he had for all eternity and become one of us, so that in him all things in heaven and on earth, because he's God and he's man, will be united together. And somehow in the plan of God and the way that the cosmos is going to work for eternity, Jesus is the link between those two things. And that, I think that the human part of that, you cannot divorce it from who Jesus would be, because that was the idea all along. This was no plan B. I mean, you all know that.
Right.
The fall wasn't a plan B. It didn't catch God off guard. Like he didn't know what was going to happen. And that means that he had this whole thing mapped out from the very beginning. And Jesus was always that eye of the hourglass through which everything else has to funnel.
It's a good question. All right, a couple more. Yes. I guess we'll just work our way down.
Could you help me understand / correct me? So we know Genesis 3, we know Satan, already bad, right? But God created him good.
That's right.
But he wanted to like be like God or something.
Sure.
And so God cast him out, and then he brought a third of the angels with him or something like that.
Sure.
And then, so where does that fit in with the Nephilim? Are those fallen angels the ones that, took the women in Genesis 6? Or is that a totally different
That's a great question.
thing that happened?
Like, that's a really good question. The question, it arises because of Revelation chapter 12. That's the only place where it says that the dragon swept a third of the stars out of heaven. And the context of that is actually not creation or Genesis 3 or Genesis 6. It's actually the birth of Jesus. Because, there's this great sign in heaven, and this baby is born who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. And so I would actually put that fall of angels. I'm not saying the fall of all angels, because other angels clearly fell in Genesis 6. I just don't think that it's referencing that. And to me, that's a warfare language, right? You've got this dragon who's fighting against Michael, and they're battling it out. And so the third of the stars in heaven seems to be, it's almost like a giant regiment of these fallen heavenly beings are thrown down to earth, because now they're going to be wreaking havoc on the earth in order to stop what's just happened in the incarnation. That's my opinion. So, but that one's debated by all kinds of people, so I'm not going to die on that.
Sure. I think it's healthy to understand that the Bible does this thing where there's like flash moments in a movie where you're given some context, but not all context. Like we're taken up into the heavens, and there's like these cherubs who are guarding God's throne, and they've got animal heads, and it's like crazy stuff, right? But we're not really told everything about what they do, right? So I think that we have flash moments where we often think there's been one fall and that was it. But the way in which the Bible describes it is that it seems like there's a lot of things going on. Psalm 82 talks about there being a rebellion. It looks like Genesis 6 is talking about being a rebellion. So in the garden, you have a rebelled being that somehow, some would say that's when Satan fell. There's some people who have a perspective then. I would see Isaiah and Ezekiel seem to make it sound like that was before then, or it could be a combination. But I think
Can I give you an illustration?
Sure.
It's just an illustration, but in the next chapter of Revelation, chapter 12, the dragon is described as having 7 heads. And so what is that in mythology? That's a hydra. Mm-hmm. And what's so interesting about it is I think it's almost like a metaphor for falls of Satan, that you chop off one head and you could say he fell. You killed the head. The problem is there's 6 more. You haven't fully killed the hydra until you chop off all the heads.
That's a great illustration.
And so in thinking that way, it allows me to go, okay, so there was a fall of Satan in the garden. There was another fall of heavenly beings in chapter 6. Maybe there was another fall taking place when Jesus was born. And the hydra image allows me to go, to at least kind of make sense of that.
And I think the early church was feeling this supernatural pressure, which is why Peter goes, I know you're seeing something in the physical realm. Paul has told us there's stuff going on in the spiritual realm. Let me remind you, Jesus has already proven victory. He put them to open shame. Their day of judgment isn't here yet, which means they're in full scatter mode, and they're going to create more havoc now than they ever have because judgment day is close. So if they create chaos to stop it. And I think that's part of the story of what John's like, yeah, when Jesus came, it got even more messy. Like it's getting nuts, which the Christian, you shouldn't cower and go, well, I'm not going outside my house. You shouldn't go outside your house unless you go out in the strength of the Lord, right? In faith. We walk by faith in the power of Jesus Christ. If you try to go walk outside the house, you're not even safe in your house. So let's just start there. But if you try to live this life outside of the power of Christ, the point is you're vulnerable and doomed. All right. One last question. I think Lou had one.
About the Nephilim, and I think it might have been mentioned. So are we saying that they were part of, or maybe a subset of the fallen angels that rebel with Lucifer, and somehow when they were cast out of heaven, and then somehow end up being here part of Earth as what we're talking about the Nephilim. I just want to get clarification on that.
Yeah. So I think most people think that an angel is, we didn't really talk about this, so hopefully this will clarify a little bit. Most people think that an angel is, a fallen angel is a demon. The explanation for demons and the origin of demons in the Old Testament is that they're actually disembodied spirits of Nephilim. So if you read the story of Genesis 6, what we're arguing is that a Nephilim is a child of an angel and a human. So it's really a demigod like Hercules who has a human mother and Zeus as a father. That becomes a Nephilim. And then a demon is when a Nephilim dies, because it's not from heaven and it's not from earth, it's somewhere in between. The idea is that its spirit didn't really belong anywhere, so it just haunted the air and ends up embodying or demonizing people because it wants to possess something which it used to have. Mm-hmm. And when you think of it like that, I think it can help bring a little bit of clarification to what a Nephilim is, and how a Nephilim isn't a fallen angel. It's the product of the union of a fallen angel doing something with humans that make him, it's a half human, half heavenly being.
So the reason why we would come to a conclusion like this is that when you look at the narrative going forward with Jesus and you understand what's going on in the Old Testament, the phrase unclean, remember this? All throughout Leviticus, unclean, unclean, unclean. Well, what is unclean? It's a definition of something that is you should have and you shouldn't have being put together. It becomes an unclean match. So in the New Testament, Jesus is casting out unclean spirits, which means this spirit, if you understand your Old Testament reference, is not supposed to be. And therefore, they're embodying humans. What's interesting is you will not, I'm going to make a statement here that I need to do a little more research on, but when Paul describes the principalities, powers, and rulers, when he describes the angelic realm, he describes them as in their created order. And then so you have the created order who rebelled, and then you have unclean spirits, which is like two different categories of beings, but they're in the same realm, which would be the spiritual realm.
Another way to help with that particular thing is, Genesis chapter 1, when it says, and God made it after its kind. Mm-hmm. And then it says, and he made it after its kind, and it after its kind, and it after its kind.
It was good.
I think it says like 7 times in chapter 1. The only other time that phrase appears anywhere else in the entire Bible is in the flood story. And it appears another like 7 times. When all the animals come on the ark, it says, and God had made that one after its kind, and it went on the ark. And he made out after its kind, and went on the ark. Why would you say that? Unless there weren't other things that weren't after their kind, because something else was happening.
That's right.
And so that is also the idea of unclean spirit that even goes before Leviticus.
That's right. Yeah, there's all kinds of, we could theorize for all night. There's a lot of fun things we could theorize. But the unclean spirit is important because what's interesting is Jesus shows up on the scene. He starts doing his miracles, and the seed, I'm going to make the last connection, of Eve is doing what to the seed of the serpent? He's removing its power and setting people free and putting them in their right and proper mind. I mean, the maniac of Gadara, right? The guy is breaking chains, living in there. And what does it say? He is sitting there in his right mind, and he goes, go home and tell everybody what has happened to you. These were under the control of an unclean spirit, and the seed of the woman came and set them free. And so what I think is interesting is going back to the series I did on the resurrection in Colossians, and we'll end with this. It says that he set the captives free and put them to open shame. And so the whole story of the Bible is not only saving sinners from disobedience to God, but we are slaves into the spiritual kingdom. And God conquered the physical problems that we had, and he conquered the spiritual problems that we had. And that's why the story matters, because you see it from Genesis all the way to the end of the story in the resurrection.
Good way to end it.
And all God's people said, amen. All right. Let me pray for us. Hey, those of you that are watching this or listening to the podcast, thanks for participating. A little bit longer one, hour or so. I guess that's pretty normal for us. No, it's an hour and a half now. I'm thinking about it. We started at 6:30.
Yeah.
And if you're ever in Nashville, we'd love for you to be here. We're south of Nashville in Spring Hill, but I can't promise you when you come, we're going to have ice cream. But tonight we are. Kids, are you ready for ice cream? Well, let's go. Let me pray. Father, I'm so thankful for our brother Doug, that you were able to bring him here and put him into our lives, that we get to think about Jesus and the hope that we have in a world that is very strange. And as much as it might scare us, we have the gospel to comfort us. In Christ's name, amen.